We all know America's legendary origins, 13 colonies fighting off the tyranny of the British Empire to form a union. But did you know that there was, if only for a brief time, an extra-legal 14th colony? In reality, there were several, Nova Scotia and East and West Florida included, that didn't join the Revolution. But where the borders of Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee meet, a colony was created by a private company. They cleared a path through the mountains, established remote settlements, and lobbied the Continental Congress to join the Union that would eventually become the United States of America. That colony's name? Transylvania. While the name might lead some to believe that vampires are involved, the word Transylvania has little to do with Dracula or Eastern Europe. It's of Latin origin, merely translating to beyond a pleasant wooded area, which perfectly describes the cut between two mountains that would allow some 300,000 people to journey through the nation's first gateway to the west. The story of how they would get there, however, is one filled with legendary frontiersmen, a revolution, and near-continuous conflict. I'm Jason Epperson, and on this episode of Parkography, the Transylvania Purchase, a land now part of Cumberland Gap National Historical Park. More in a moment, but first, this episode is sponsored by Slinky Stove. Slinky Stove is the patented collapsible fire pit that stays intact when packed. It's perfect for RVs and car camping or in your own backyard. It sets up in seconds, providing you with smokeless airflow rings and a clean burning fire. No more dancing around campfire smoke. Inexpensive and packed with extras, the Slinky Stove offers a 3-level cooking system that gives you flexibility, whether it's morning coffee or evening campfire chili. And with contained ash, cleanup's quick, just the way it should be on public lands. Order yours now at slinkystove.com or click the link in the description. In the early 1700s, the Allegheny Mountains were the greatest obstacle for settlers aspiring to move west. That changed when, in 1750, Dr. Thomas Walker, a Virginian physician and explorer, found a cut between two of the peaks, securing a cross that would, for centuries to come, allow for safe passage for travelers from around the world. Of course, as so many things go, it had already been long used before by Indigenous people. The gap sits at 1,631 feet above sea level and is just one of many such passes through the broader Appalachian mountain range, but one of just a few in the continuous Cumberland mountain ridgeline. It's located on the border of present-day Kentucky and Virginia and sits approximately a quarter of a mile northeast of the tri-state marker with Tennessee. The nearby Cumberland River was named by Walker in 1750 for Prince William, Duke of Cumberland, and son of King George II of Great Britain, and the name spread to other features of the region, including the Gap. By 1769, Joseph Martin, who would eventually go on to serve as a brigadier general in the American Revolutionary War, had built a fort at present-day Rose Hill, but conflict with Native Americans caused him to leave until 1775. That same year, Daniel Boone, the famed American pioneer and frontiersman, was hired by Richard Henderson to blaze a trail through the mountain gap, set up towns, and negotiate with Indigenous people in the area. The entire scheme was a part of a much larger project. Henderson was intent on establishing a new British colony by purchasing the lands on the Kentucky side of the Appalachian Mountains from the Cherokee, who were the primary inhabitants of the area at the time. This was a complicated and ambitious affair, as the Royal Proclamation of 1763 that had ended the French and Indian War also declared lands west of the Appalachians as Indian territory, and any colonial settlement was forbidden. It didn't stop colonial explorers, traders, and trappers, though, and a long series of additional treaties were made with Native Americans, many of which required them to concede lands in exchange for peace. Boone was no stranger to the conflict in the mountains, having first entered Kentucky territory in 1767. He'd participate in what would become known as Dunmore's War, a struggle between Virginia and American Indians for control of what is now West Virginia and Kentucky. The war would eventually end with the Shawnee relinquishing their claims to the land. In March of 1775, Henderson and Boone met with more than 1,200 Cherokee at Sycamore Shoals with the intent of signing a treaty procuring all the land south of the Ohio River and between the Cumberland River, the Cumberland Mountains, and the Kentucky River. It amounted to 20 million acres of land. The treaty was disavowed by some of the chiefs who had gathered, including Cherokee Chief Dragging Canoe, who declared it as bloody ground and will be dark and difficult to settle. He would eventually be proven correct, but the majority won out and Henderson and his partners purchased the land. Dragging Canoe left the treaty grounds and went south, landing in the remote area of the Chickamauga Creek near modern-day Chattanooga, and established 11 towns that would resist settlers for decades. Henderson, meanwhile, believed that a British legal opinion had made his private purchase of the land legal, but the Transylvania Company's investment was still in violation of both Virginia and North Carolina law, along with the earlier Royal Proclamation of 1763. To make matters worse, the Shawnee, who were not part of the Sycamore Shoals Treaty, laid claim to some of the land supposedly purchased from the Cherokee. In short, the land inhabited by indigenous people, long before colonists and settlers appeared, wasn't purchased, it was taken. Still, Henderson proceeded, once again hiring Daniel Boone to blaze a trail through the mountains. Eventually known as the Wilderness Road, which trailed from southwestern Virginia north through the Cumberland Gap and into central Kentucky, the trail was difficult and dangerous. The initial 200-mile path was cleared by Boone and 35 axemen, and it was hardly more than a rough and muddy trek from Kingsport, Tennessee, through the forests and mountains. The group also faced attacks from Native Americans who hadn't agreed to Henderson's purchase of the land, viewing Boone and his party as invaders. Just before the conclusion of their journey, they were ambushed by a group of Shawnee, in which some of the party were killed or wounded, but most escaped into the woods. When Boone finally reached the Kentucky River, he established the settlement of Boonesboro, which sits near present-day Lexington, Kentucky, and settlers quickly followed. The original trail was difficult to traverse, making wagon travel impossible, but many still set out on the journey west. Along the way, they faced regular attacks from the Shawnee and Chickamauga tribes, robbers frequented the edges of the route, and venomous copperheads and rattlesnakes blended into the undergrowth, endangering people and livestock. Oftentimes, entire communities would take on the Wilderness Road together to form new settlements on the other side of the mountains. And many of those people refused to recognize Transylvania's authority, leading to further conflict for everyone on the trail. But Henderson wasn't far behind, and in the footsteps of Boone, he led an expedition of 30 horsemen to widen the road so travelers could bring through wagons. Around 150 pioneers joined his party, including some who had been traveling ahead but were retreating after Shawnee attacks further down the road. When Henderson arrived in Boonesboro, just under 100 people resided there, and all settlers were living in a precarious situation. Boonesboro, which was intended to be the capital of the newly founded Transylvania colony, lacked supplies and adequate shelter. Weary travelers faced continuing hostility from the Shawnee, who were then joined by the Cherokee and other tribes. The conflict would grow into the Cherokee-American Wars, which would last another 20 years, also known as the Chickamauga Wars. The battles included raids, ambushes, minor skirmishes, and several full-scale frontier battles. Henderson did his best to proceed amidst the conflict, urging settlers in the area to formally establish the colony and hold a constitutional convention. His plan was for the various settlements throughout Transylvania to send delegates to Boonesboro, and they did. And in May 1775, a 3-day convention assembled under a huge elm tree. They would pass 9 measures and draft a document known as the Transylvania Compact, which included the framework of a government consisting of an executive, legislative, and judicial branch. With the documents in hand, Henderson then returned to North Carolina to petition the Continental Congress to make Transylvania a legally recognized colony. Virginia and North Carolina, who both claimed jurisdiction over the region, didn't consent, and the Continental Congress declined to get involved. Meanwhile, over 200,000 pioneers made the journey along the Wilderness Road, many Scottish, Irish, and German. New immigrants had to push west and endure hardships, and many families would walk hundreds of miles immediately after arriving in America, often crossing the icy creeks and rivers without shoes or stockings. One year, the weather was so cold that the Kentucky River froze to a depth of 2 feet. Many of the cattle and hogs froze to death, and settlers were forced to eat frozen livestock to survive. And then came the American Revolution. Many American Indians saw the conflict as an opportunity to drive out colonists, who were often relatively isolated in the Kentucky wilderness. Dragging canoes Chickamauga would often ambush the Gap area for weeks. And on July 14, 1776, just days after the formal signing of the Declaration of Independence, Boone's daughter Jemima and 2 other girls were captured and carried north to the Shawnee towns of Ohio country. Boone led a group of men in pursuit, catching up with them 2 days later. They ambushed the Shawnee while they were stopped for a meal, and the girls were rescued. In response to the numerous attacks in the Gap area, Henry Hamilton, British Lieutenant Governor of Canada, began to recruit American Indian war parties to raid the Kentucky settlements. On April 24, 1777, the British-aided Shawnee, led by Chief Blackfish, attacked Boonesboro, where the newly formed militia of Kentucky County, Virginia, were mustered. Enslaved men fought alongside their owners from behind fort walls, and Boone was shot in the ankle while outside the fort during the skirmish. As he recovered, Shawnees destroyed the surrounding cattle and crops, causing food to again run low in the settlement. Boone led a party of 30 men to the salt springs on the Licking River to gather the salt needed to preserve the little meat the settlers had left. While hunting for the expedition, Boone was captured by Blackfish and his warriors, and he convinced his vastly outnumbered party to surrender to the Shawnee. Recognizing the opportunity, Blackfish intended to return to Boonesboro to capture it, but Boone then convinced him that women and children housed there wouldn't survive a winter trek back through the Gap, and in a bluff so convincing that many of his men thought he had turned his loyalty to the British, Boone promised that the settlement would instead willingly surrender in the spring. His actions saved the settlement and his men, who were taken alongside Boone to Blackfish's town of Chillicothe. As was their custom, they adopted some of the prisoners into their family to replace fallen warriors, with Boone perhaps adopted directly into Blackfish's family. Given the name of Xolotli, or Big Turtle, Boone would travel with Blackfish throughout the winter until he learned of the intention of the Shawnee to return to Boonesboro in large force the following June. Evading his captors, Boone raced home, covering 160 miles in just 5 days on horseback and on foot. But when he arrived, his men expressed doubts about his loyalty. To prove himself, he would lead a preemptive raid against the Shawnee before helping to successfully defend the settlement in a 10-day siege led by Blackfish in September of 1778. Still, charges were brought against Boone in the form of a court-martial. While he was found not guilty, Boone was humiliated by the trial and rarely ever spoke of it. 3 years after Daniel Boone initially cleared the Wilderness Road in December of 1778, Virginia's Assembly officially declared the Transylvania claim void and took possession of the land. Henderson and his partners would receive 12 square miles along the Ohio River, just below the Green River, as consolation, an area now known as Henderson. Daniel Boone never returned to Boonesboro, instead founding the settlement of Boone's Station, Kentucky, and began earning money finding land for new settlers. Now required to file land claims with Virginia, Boone collected about $20,000 in cash from various land purchasers, which is equivalent to over $450,000 today. He took the funds on behalf of settlers to Williamsburg to purchase the warrants, but the cash was stolen while he was sleeping. Most of the pioneers forgave Boone for the loss, but it took him several years to pay off those who didn't. In his later years, Daniel Boone contrasted his rugged frontiersman stereotype to become a leading citizen of Kentucky. When the territory was divided into 3 Virginia counties in 1780, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel in the Fayette County Militia and fought in several Revolutionary War battles. When he was elected as a representative to the Virginia General Assembly in 1781, he traveled to Richmond, only to be captured by the British along with several other legislators near Charlottesville. The British released him a few days later. After a term in office, Boone returned to fight in the war, including in the Battle of Blue Licks, in which his son, Israel, was killed. In November of 1782, as the skirmishes continued following the Battle of Yorktown, Boone also took part in an expedition into Ohio that would be the last major campaign of the war. A series of failed business ventures would then ultimately see Daniel Boone settling in Missouri, where he would spend his final years. He died in 1820 at the age of 85. The road Daniel Boone cut through the break in the mountains would eventually become part of Cumberland Gap National Historical Park, which was established by Franklin Roosevelt in 1940 and dedicated on July 4, 1959, to commemorate the story of the first doorway to the West. Earlier attempts to create a national park to protect the area, including surrounding Civil War battlefields, had failed, but the National Park Service agreed to support the creation of a park provided the surrounding states purchase and deed the land to the federal government. Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee would all contribute to the project, and the park now includes 85 miles of trails and 24,000 acres of wilderness. The Cumberland Gap Tunnel now provides access for travelers looking to find safe passage through the mountains. The Bureau of Public Roads had covered the original wilderness road with U.S. Highway 25E in 1908, but the highway was heavily trafficked, little more than a winding 2.5-mile ribbon of crushed, compacted, and rolled limestone. Accidents became commonplace, earning the trek the nickname Massacre Mountain. To connect Middleborough, Kentucky and Cumberland Gap, Tennessee, the National Park Service would propose a tunnel to replace the road in 1956, and the project was approved by Congress in 1979, with construction completed and the tunnel finally opening to traffic in 1996. Now, just a 6-foot wide trail, not too different from the one first carved by Daniel Boone, sits atop the gap. 18,000 vehicles on average passed through the park before the tunnel was built. Many times more travel through the tunnel today, and travelers continue to follow in the footsteps of Native Americans, long hunters, and pioneers heading west. Today, Cumberland Gap National Historical Park features spectacular overlooks, cascading waterfalls, traces of Civil War battles, and a cave. The park's open year-round, 24 hours a day, and most visits start at the Visitor Center, located just off Highway 25E, south of Middlesboro, Kentucky. Tours of Gap Cave are offered from May through September, and reservations must be made by noon the day before your desired tour date by calling ahead. Another tour takes visitors to the historic Hensley settlement, where the stories of early 20th century Appalachian communities are told through numerous historic buildings and structures. The 150-site Wilderness Road Campground is located just 3 miles from the Visitor Center off Highway 58 in Virginia. Electrical hookups are available at 43 of the sites, and the campground provides water and hot showers. Backcountry camping is also available in some of the more remote wilderness areas of the park. Thanks so much for being here. If you like what we do here, the best thing you can do to support us is to hit the subscribe button. We'll see you next time on Parkography.